Yeah, we've got a little bit of a lengthy passage of scripture today, so I'm going to be reading it again as we kind of go along this morning. But before we jump into that, I think it was 1977, had some great films up for Best Movie of the Year, All the President's Men, All the King's Men. I forgot. It was slightly before I was born. All the President's Men, The Road to Glory, Taxi Cab Driver. These movies ring a bell? I don't know. But all I know is all of them, they lost out to a movie that, a low-budget film, kind of been written in 3 days and filmed in less than a month. Any guesses? 1977. Low-budget film, quickly thrown together. Give you one more clue. Put the Philadelphia Art Museum on the map. Rocky, yeah. Quickly became a blockbuster hit of the year. A great film. Right, but why? Because it became it captured the psyche of the American people, right? We all love a good underdog story. We all love a little man versus the big man. That's why we watch these films. For me, like I said, I came a little bit after Rocky, so for me it was Daniel LaRusso. Oh, Jeffrey, you coming on up here? Hey, bud. Yeah, anyway, where was I? Yeah, for me, it was Daniel LaRusso taking on Johnny and the boys from Cobra Kai in Karate Kid. That was my little guy versus the big guy movie, right? So we love these stories. That's why we watch these movies. Or we get raptured up in news headlines like we've seen recently of some Reddit day traders taking down the evil hedge fund operators, whatever. Sorry, I don't mean to poke at hedge fund people. No, you're not a hedge fund. Anyway, our financial guys in here, they know much more about it than I do anyway. Or we love, or this is why the Eagles Super Bowl victory back in 2017 will forever probably be the second best thing that happened in this city since the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because a bunch of beleaguered, beaten down, injury-riddled Eagles took down the great and evil empire of Tom Brady and Bill Belichick and where's Chris Ermel this morning? I don't see him today. I put that in there just for him, but he's not even here. Oh, well, anyway. Right, but so we love these stories, which is why that the passage that we're looking at today is easily one of the most familiar, one of the most best-loved stories in the whole Bible. Right, today we have the fun opportunity to just kind of walk our way through the David and Goliath story. Right, and so that's what we're going to do. We're just going to kind of immerse ourselves in this great story in the text today. But as we do, we've got a little bit of work that we have to do, partly because I think it's so much our love for the good David and Goliath story, or the little man versus the big man story, that enables us, or that causes us sometimes to miss a little bit of the nuance, the theological nuance of the story, which is actually a really important point that's being made in this passage. We want to dig at that. We also want to be really careful about how we apply this text as well, too. Sometimes our love for the little guy stories helps us, or causes us to apply this story in strange ways. So we're just going to kind of settle in and do our best to listen very carefully to what's going on in this story. Like I mentioned, it's probably the longest chapter we've had so far in the book of 1 Samuel, so I'm not going to read it straight through. Instead, I'm going to kind of summarize the events, and what I am going to read for you is the dialogue. Right, the dialogue that takes place, because it's in that dialogue that you get the real theology, the real point, the real application of this whole message this morning. Okay? Those guys are crazy this morning. All right. So let's just kind of dive in and talk our way through it, right? If you know the story, familiar, we've got the Israelites and the Philistines drawing up for battle again, just like they have done all throughout the book. This time they're drawing up for battle in the southern part of Israel, down in Judah, in the valley of Elah. And so you got the Philistines on one side of the valley, the Israelites on the other side of the valley. And this time you got one guy from the Philistines who's coming out and saying, hey, why are we going at this again? drawing up our lines for battle. I got a better idea. Let's go mano a mano, winner take all. Right? He's kind of a proud, cocky fellow. He comes down there and says, you send somebody out who can, stand up with me. And if I win, you guys have to serve us. But if you win, we'll come and we'll serve you. We get a little bit of a description of Goliath in this passage. But here's the thing, got to be careful. When we think of Goliath, what do we think of? We automatically go to his size. That's right, Goliath has become literally synonymous with massive size. But you need to notice that in the text isn't really fully enamored with his size. Actually, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but there's substantial evidence to suggest that Goliath was probably a shade shorter than Joel Embiid. Or it's probably about the size of your average NBA basketball player. Maybe, maybe not. We can talk about that later. But either way, the text is actually more fascinated or more concerned with what the guy's wearing when he comes down into the valley. Right? He's got a bronze helmet on. He's got a bronze coat of mail, of scales, that weighs about 100 pounds, 5,000 shekels. He's got bronze armor all the way down his legs. He's got this massive spear whose shaft is kind of like, the rod that sits on top of a weaver's loom. And the spear tip itself is about 13 pounds. He's got a massive shield that has to be carried by his shield bearer, right? And so the text, it dives into more of those things than it does just his size, though clearly he's a massive dude. If he can carry around a 100-pound, I'm pretty sure a 100-pound coat of mail would just break most bones in my body at that point. But anyway, so he comes out and he stood and he shouted, this is verse 8, the ranks of Israel. And he says, why have you come to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself. Let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we'll be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. 40 days he comes out. And every day, I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and we'll fight it. We'll have it out together. In 40 days, nobody moves. Nobody budges. It's actually a little bit ironic that in his taunts to the Israelites, he says, am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? It's a little bit ironic because, think about it. This is Saul's big opportunity. Right? This is exactly why the Israelites wanted a king. They wanted a king who was just like all the surrounding nations. They didn't want any ordinary king. They wanted a king like the nations have. Give us a king who's mighty in battle, who can fight our wars for us. And in some ways, they got what they asked for. They got Saul, who himself was head and shoulders above all the rest. He probably wasn't too much shorter than Goliath himself. We read that Saul himself has a helmet and a coat of armor, a sword, a shield, a spear. So this is his big moment. Israelites were even willing to sacrifice their sons and daughters, their fields, or their resources. You remember when Samuel told them this is going to happen? And they said, no, that's fine. Give us one of these kings. And now look at this. Where's this king? In verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Right? Saul sitting on the sidelines, cowering a little bit. And because he's on the sidelines, you got everybody on the bank of the hill that they're not moving. They're kind of paralyzed as well too. Right? The people on the one side of the valley, they've got one eye looking down in the valley, seeing this Goliath down there with his sword and his shield and his spear and his coats of armor, and they're totally captivated by this beast of a man down there. No, I'm not, and then with their other eye, they're looking at Saul, their king, just like the surrounding nations, and he's just hanging back, dismayed and greatly afraid. And so as these are the things that are captivating their vision, they're paralyzed. They say, I'm not moving. Kids, it would be like if you were, you're going for a walk at night or something like that, and you turned a corner down some little street that's a little bit narrow, a little bit dark, and you don't know where you haven't maybe been here before. You're walking with mom and dad, and you say, Mom and Dad, you go first, because I'm a little nervous about this. And I'll kind of walk behind you and you hold my hand, but if you go first, then I know it's okay. All right? The Israelites, they're staying there waiting for Saul. Are you going to go first? And Saul ain't moving. And so they're paralyzed with fear. Okay? So then enter who? Enter David. David is the last son of Jesse. Probably not quite yet of military age, so he can't enlist in the military just yet. So he's kind of the errand boy, and he's going back and forth, the text says, from the battle or from Saul, delivering supplies, and then going back home and caring for the sheep on his dad's farm, because his dad's getting a little bit older in age and can't quite do all that anymore. And so David comes in this one time, and he's bringing supplies to his three brothers, Eliab, Aminadab, and Shammah. And while he's there giving the supplies, just before he leaves, you get the whole episode where Goliath comes out and he starts throwing his taunts against the Israelites. And David's there, and he's listening to these taunts, and he's listening to these insults that this guy is hurling across the valley. And he says in verse 26, hey, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? There's that insult again. Did you catch it? Who's this uncircumcised Philistine? It's the same thing Jonathan said, remember a couple chapters ago when he was about ready to storm another valley and take a garrison of Philistines. He said to his guys, come on, let's go over to this garrison of uncircumcised men. Maybe the Lord will give them into our hands. Right? And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. We said this is not just like some crass insult that David is hurling here. This is a theological insult. Right? Because circumcision, perhaps odd as it may have been, was the sign that God and the Israelites were in covenant relationship. That they had this agreement, this arrangement together where God's saying, okay, look, I'm going to be your God. I got great stuff for you. I'm going to take you into a land of promise. I'm going to cause you to be fruitful and multiply. I'm going to cause your fields to flourish. And I'm going to defend you in that land. I'm going to drive out in front of you all of your enemies. And look, here's the sign of my promise to you. The sign of circumcision. Right? You wear this sign and you forever know I am your God. I'm your provider. I'm your protector. I'm your defender. I got this. And so here's David coming and saying, who's this uncircumcised guy over there who dares to defy the armies of the living God? It'd be like, okay, imagine as a Valentine's Day, I take Amy out for dinner. She's not here, so she can't give me that ugly look because I haven't done that yet. But she's probably watching on the screen in the room. Sorry, Amy. But I take her out for dinner, and let's say we double date, and you and your husband or wife, whatever, you come on this date with us, and while we're sitting there having dinner, having a conversation, this brawny, strapping, good-looking guy comes over, pulls up a chair right between Amy and me, and he looks at Amy and he starts sweet-talking Amy and start hitting on my wife while we're eating dinner. And I say, hey, I get it, man. She's a beautiful woman, and but she's my wife, and so, and he looks at me, and he says, yeah. Well, clearly she can do much better than you. I mean, look at me, look at you, and so, yeah, whatever. And he turns around and he goes back and he starts talking to Amy, sweet talk, and you're sitting next to me, and you look at me and he says, he's got a point. I've seen you in the swimming pool. I've seen you trying to change your oil. He's probably much better for her, or whatever, And I say, okay, fine, that may be so, but look what's on her hand. She's got a ring on her that I gave to her the day we got married. And I made a promise to her. And look what's on my hand. I got the other ring that she gave to me when she made a promise to me. She was going to love me, and she was going to love me until the day that she dies. And so who's this unringed fool who's coming in here with his good looks or whatever, thinking that he can entice my wife away from the promise that she made to me, right? It's that same sort of picture. Like David's coming in here and saying, who is this unringed, uncircumcised fool who thinks that he can come and defy Or who are we that we're in any way cowering behind this uncircumcised fool? We're the ones with the promises. We're the ones with this covenantal arrangement. He's uncircumcised. He doesn't have the sign. What kind of fool comes and defies the armies of the living God? Okay, which actually is another important point here as well, too. You see, when Goliath comes out and he starts taunting the Israelites, he says, look, am I not a Philistine and are you not a servant of Saul? I defy you Israelites. And David knows, okay, this isn't a little skirmish between Goliath and the Israelites. Or this isn't a skirmish between Goliath and King Saul. This is a skirmish. This is a dude who's out here defying the armies of the living God, Yahweh, the Lord of hosts. It's actually a really main point in the passage. It's probably this passage shouldn't be called David and Goliath. It should be called Yahweh and Goliath. David's just the servant who shows up and takes care of business. But this is really a match between Goliath and the living God. Anyway, we'll come back around to that. So Eliab, David's brother, gosh, what are you doing, David? You shouldn't be talking like this. David keeps going on and on, keep asking his questions to people, so much so that it gets to the ears of Saul. Saul calls for David. He comes, and here we go in verse 31. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth, and he's been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, look, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear who took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, and I struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. There's that phrase again. And David said, the Lord, Yahweh, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Right? Saul's not like, sorry, I'm going to get all my names mixed up. David's not like one of those guys on the hill who's got one eye on Goliath, this massive giant of a man with all of his armor and shield and sword, and another eye on Saul, waiting to see if Saul's going to lead the charge. David's a guy who's got his eyes on Yahweh, who over the years has proven himself faithful to David and to the promises of care and protection that he's given to him, and has also proven himself powerful, such that even if a lion or a bear comes up against David, Yahweh delivers him or delivers them easily into his hands. And so that's the stuff that David has his eyes on, the power and the faithfulness of God. And so let no man's heart fail. He says, I'll go out and we'll take care of business with this uncircumcised Philistines who is defying the living God. Saul says to him, okay, we'll go and be with you. And then he takes some of his armor. You know the story. He takes the helmet. He takes the coat, and he puts it on David. And here again, you want to be careful. We sometimes have this vision of David, this tiny little guy, and he gets all this big stuff, and he can't fit into it, and it's clunky on him. That's actually not what the text says. The text doesn't say anything. It might have fit him just perfectly for all we know. The text says, David said, I haven't tested this stuff. This is not what I usually wear when I go out into the field or whenever I'm a shepherd. I have no idea how this sort of stuff works. I haven't tested it. So no thanks. I don't need it. Just give me my sling. I'll go grab a few rocks. No problem. All right. So off he goes, gets his stuff, starts venturing down towards Goliath. Goliath sees him. And here we are in verse 43. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. It's actually a pretty, naively self-aware comment here. In his defiance of the living God, he is like a beast. He is like a dog. He is like a lion or bear who stands opposed to God's servant. He's like, with his scales, he's like the snake in the garden that came in defiance against the living God. He's like the beast in that garden that needed to be cast out and be promised one day he would have a crushed head. right? So the Philistine says to David, "Come to me, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." And then David said to the Philistine, and then here's really the whole theological point of this whole story. "You come at me with a sword and with a spear and with javelin." Again, he doesn't say, "You come at me with your big, tall self." Because that's not the point. This point is the military weaponry that he's coming. "You come at me with sword and spear and with javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled this day," or whom you have defiled. Again, I'm re-emphasizing this point. You catch it, right? Goliath sees this as a battle between him and the armies of Saul, or him and the Philistines. He defies the Philistines, and David said, no, you've got it all wrong, to your demise. This is not a battle between you and Saul. It's not a battle between you and the Philistines. Not even really a battle between you and me. This is a battle between you and Yahweh, whom you have defied today, right? And so you come at me with sword and shield and spear and whatever else you want to bring to this. I'm coming at you with Yahweh. And this day, in verse 46, the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I'll strike you down, cut off your head, and I'll give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth. And then here's the other big theological point, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, there it is, and he will give you into our hand. Right, this is the other important point that David is right on, right? We say it all the time. What was the whole point of Israel? The whole point of Israel was to be, in a way, God's priests, his holy nation, who declared in their life and in their reliance on God's faithfulness and power, declared to all the nations that there is a God in Israel, and this God saves, right? The Israelites were the people who were supposed to go out into all corners of the broken creation, people who were dying because they were entrusting themselves into flawed, knockoff saviors, redeemers. They were the ones who were supposed to represent in their lives and in their commitment to the faithfulness and power of God that there is a God in Israel, and this God saves. And he don't need sword and spear. He saves. It's his fight. He will win. And David gets that. I could say this too, that the real tragedy of the paralyzed Israelites on the hill, or the real tragedy of the paralyzed Saul sitting cowering on his throne wherever he is that the nations now have no living testimony that there's actually a God in Israel who's worth anything, or who could actually save, or who could actually stand up to sword and spear. Had it been left there, that would have been a tragic scene. But thankfully, there's the one who's confident in God's faithfulness and power and goes out and stands it. Goliath starts to approach him. We find David runs at him. And about 50 verses into it, we get 2 quick verses. David grabs a stone, puts it in his sling, chucks it at this guy's head. Boom, falls over face down just like the mighty Dagon did. Game over. Done. That's it. 50 verses to get here, and it's 2 verses. He picks up a stone, wings it at him, his head falls over. And so here's the thing. This is not, right, if you think about it, this is not like any normal little guy story. This is not like Rocky. Or it's not like Daniel LaRusso in The Karate Kid, where you first have to get, beaten and bloodied and battered, and your eye has to be swollen so that you can only see out of the one eye, and with your grimacing on your one hand side, you grab to get ready to do the crane kick. No, it's none of that. There's nothing. David just grabs a stone, swings it at his head, and because the battle belongs to the Lord, it's done before it even starts. Right? You see that? And then just like the mighty Dagon fell face down and lost his head, so David decides to alleviate the mighty Goliath of the burden of his own head. This is why Fuzzy wanted to preach about the anointing of David. I offered him first David and Goliath, and he didn't know, how am I going to preach about this guy walking around with the head of Goliath in his hand? But yes, he does. And now, so he's got this hand, he's standing down the valley, he's got the head of Goliath. And now all of a sudden you start to hear from the top of the hill hoots and hollers, cheers. battle cry, your war cry, right? Because the guys on the hill, they've seen God, oh yeah, prove his power, prove his faithfulness through eliminating the mighty Goliath through this little servant boy, David. And so they know that, yeah, God's in this fight. And so they're all hooped up and they're all ready to go. And they rush down into the valley, chase the Philistines as far as Gath and Ekron, totally, defeat them, plunder them, take the spoils for war, and go back. And there's our story, right? Key point of the story, really. The whole point that's being made here, right? This has been a point, hopefully you've picked up all throughout the book, is that there is a God in Israel, and he fights for Israel's behalf, right? So you don't need to be asking for a king like the nations. You don't need to get all worked up about chariots and these weapons of iron, these mighty, right? There's a God who fights for you. That's the point. And he has, and he proves himself, he proves his faithfulness, he proves his power in this defeat of Goliath. So in the last couple of minutes we have here, so what's the point for us? What do we do with this? Well, that's certainly a big theological point for us to hang our hat on, that God is faithful to his covenant promises, that God is powerful to actually do the things that he promises, so we can take full confidence in that. But if we push a little bit further, I guess I would say this, sometimes when I hear applications of this story, the application usually sounds like it's, we're like David, we're down in the valley and, we have these insurmountable obstacles in front of us. And so we grab our 5 smooth stones, whatever they are, and, and with God's help, we go and we slay our Goliaths and whatnot, which, okay, there might be some measure of theological truth there, but I think probably more accurately, if we want to bring ourselves into this story, we should see ourselves more, I think, as the guys up on the ridge. Right? We're the Israelites standing up on top of the ridge, looking down into the valley and seeing this massive, hideous enemy before us. And truth be told, here's the bad news, we're staring down an enemy that's infinitely greater than Goliath ever was. Right? We're standing down in the valley and we're looking at spiritual enemies of the living God that rail against him and against his people and want nothing more, who are hell-bent on dragging all of his creation back into chaos and darkness. We stare down into the valley and we see rulers and powers and principalities, these spiritual forces of evil that lurk in the shadows of human evil, evil of violence and arrogance and injustice and hatred. Right? We stare down the valley and we see perhaps Satan himself, who has the power of death and who at times has claimed authority over the empires and the military regimes all across the world, all throughout history, that have wreaked their havoc and have wreaked terror upon God's people. Right? And we look down at those spiritual enemies, or we look down into the valley as well too, and we see Satan, who wields the power of death. And we look down into the valley and we see the spiritual power, the spiritual enemy of sin itself. Right? The spiritual power of sin itself that has so at times captivated our hearts, wreaked havoc in our lives and in our relationships, and has caused us to accrue this record of wickedness, this list of debts that we couldn't possibly pay. And we look at all of this down in the valley, and rightfully so, we stand on the hillside paralyzed, because how in the world could any one of us make a dent in any of that? Right? But the incredible news, the great news, the good part of the story is that we have one who's infinitely greater than Goliath. We have one who's infinitely greater than David, infinitely greater than Saul, who has come. Right? One who has come, and because he was so confident in the power and the faithfulness of God, went toe-to-toe with the devil for 40 days in the wilderness and was not shaken in the least by him. We have one who's come, according to the book of Colossians, has triumphed over the rulers and principalities, these spiritual forces of darkness, and put them to open shame in his victory on the cross. Right, we have one who has come, according to the book of Hebrews, and says in his carnation has come to destroy the works of the devil and his power of death that had so enslaved people in that fear of death. We have one who's come to destroy the works of the devil. We have one who's come and in his own words has bound up the strong man of the house. We have one who's come and entered into that valley, and because he had spears thrust into his side, and because he had nails, the weaponry of the evil empire, thrust into his hands, and because he was willing to endure all that the enemy could throw at him, even death itself, so that you wouldn't have to, because he endured all of that, our record of sin has been wiped away fully. We've been fully atoned for. We've been fully forgiven. We've been fully brought into this great covenant relationship with all of its truths, all of its theological richness, with all of its promises. We have one who, in his resurrection from the dead, according to Paul in 2 Timothy, has fully abolished the power of death forever, and who will one day usher all of us into full resurrection life and declare in mocking of death, "Where, O death, is your sting? Where, O death, is your victory?" We have one who, because of his resurrection, now can gather his disciples together and say, "Guys, all power and authority under heaven and earth now belongs to me." Such that every moment of history now bends itself according to my good kingdom purposes. Every event, every circumstance, every situation, every trial that you will face ultimately now always works for the good of my people, for the salvation of my church, and the redemption of my creation. And so now who implores his people, come on, let's go. All power and authority in heaven and earth belongs to me. So come with me. Let's go. Let's plunder the kingdom of the enemy. Let's go out into all tongues, tribe, and nation, make disciples, get what's mine, plunder the kingdom of the enemy. See, look, in other words, here's the great news. We're on the hill, right? But we engage the battle. We engage this fight with the victory already accomplished. Right? We're not standing on the hill looking down, wondering how this is going to play out. We stand on the hill with the victory in our rear view. Or as one person put it, we enter into the fray not for victory, but we enter into the fray from victory. Right? Because one has come who has conquered already. Right? And so as we stand on the hill, we don't dare look down at those spiritual forces of darkness, those spiritual forces of evil, the power of sin, the power of death, and let that become the consuming thing which paralyzes us. Or we don't dare look off to the side and we look to the technologies of the age or the rulers and leaders of today's world and assuming that maybe they'll come and provide deliverance and salvation for us. No, we look to the King who's conquered, right? And who has demonstrated and proven the power and the faithfulness of God, and we follow him in a battle. We look down at the hill and we see the true king with the head of the snake in his hand already crushed, and we follow him headlong into battle. Knowing that it might be tough and hard, that the body of the snake is still twisting and convulsing and wreaking its havoc on God's people. And so we might be called to endure hardship and ridicule, suffering. We might be called to fight with the weapons that our king fought with, willingly laying himself down, sacrificing himself, or as Paul said, we carry around in our body the death of Christ so that life of Christ may be at work in you. That might be part of it. But we go with our eyes, our hearts, our imagination fully captured. We're fully enraptured by the King who has conquered and put those enemies to open shame. We don't stand paralyzed by fear. We don't stand paralyzed by fear of death. We don't stand paralyzed by the fear of the power of sin, which so often seems to trip us up and frustrate us and get us down. We don't stand paralyzed by the pain of loss that we experience. We feel all those things, yes, but with our eyes fully fixed on Christ, the conquering King, we are confident in the faithfulness and the power of God. I would just say this. This is why we come to church each week. If you read up our articles of faith, or you pull up any of the old confessions of the Christian church, they would say, every week you got to set aside one day, quite literally, to celebrate, to remember and to celebrate the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Because every other day of the week, you're out there standing on the ridgetop looking down the valley and you're seeing some pretty hefty stuff. And you're feeling pretty hefty stuff. And you're feeling this paralyzation. And so every week you need to come back And you need to sing about it. You need to preach it from the Word. You need to talk about it with one another. Hey, we live in a totally different world where our King has already conquered. Sin has already conquered. Satan has already conquered the power of death. And every week, armed with that vision of the world, vision of history, we move back out into our workplaces. We move back out into our relationships. We move back out into our struggles and our hardships. And we find the resolve to follow our King. In other words, I'll close it with this. We'll close with how we opened it. We need the vision of the writer of the book of Revelation, who before all hell breaks loose, right, in the book, and all this crazy stuff and dragons and beasts and, all starts to come to the surface, his first overriding vision is this: grace and peace from him who is, from him who was, and who is yet to come. From the seven spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler, the kings of the earth. May we have our eyes fixed on him, and may we follow him into whatever comes our way tomorrow, the next day, and the next. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.